A single moment can change everything, transforming lives in ways we never expect. Bethany, a flight attendant, didn't think twice as she slapped an elderly black man. Little did she know, he was a billionaire. Just 2 minutes later, she would confront the most significant reckoning of her career as the consequences of her actions unfolded. How would this encounter reshape Bethany's life? Before diving into the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Sebastian Dixon stepped into the first-class cabin of the airplane, his weathered hands tightly holding a well-used leather briefcase. At 60 years old, his gray-white hair and kind eyes reflected a life rich with experiences. Wealth doesn't always come with flashy displays. Sometimes, it's hidden behind a kind smile and a humble demeanor. Despite being a billionaire, Sebastian's appearance was far from extravagant. Dressed in a simple light gray suit, he looked more like a friendly neighbor than a powerful businessman. As he walked down the aisle, he nodded politely to the other passengers, his gentle smile putting them at ease. Most had no idea they were in the presence of one of the richest men in the country, and that suited Sebastian just fine. He had never been one for showboating or making a fuss. When he reached his seat, Sebastian carefully stowed his briefcase in the overhead compartment and sank into the plush leather chair with a quiet sigh of relief. It had been a long day of meetings filled with significant decisions and heavy discussions. Now, all he wanted was a peaceful flight home. A flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Can I get you anything to drink, sir?" she asked. "Just water, please," Sebastian replied softly. "Thank you." As the attendant moved away, Sebastian gazed out the window at the bustling airport beyond. He reflected on how far he had come from his humble beginnings. Growing up, he never could have imagined flying first class, let alone owning his own company. Life had been hard, filled with struggles and setbacks, yet those challenges had shaped him into the man he was today. Closing his eyes for a moment, he felt grateful for all he had achieved. But more than the money or the success, he took pride in the good he had done in the world. His philanthropic work brought him more joy than any luxury ever could. In a world where appearances can be deceiving, one moment can change everything, both for the accused and the accuser. The plane began to fill up around Sebastian, the quiet hum of conversation growing louder. He pulled a book from his carry-on bag, looking forward to getting lost in its pages during the flight. As he opened it, a sense of contentment washed over him. Hello friends, right now write in the comments your name and where you are watching this video from. We really appreciate each of you. You are incredibly important to us and to the promotion of our channel. Thanks to you, we can tell such stories and open our eyes to injustice. You are our inspiration, and together, we can make this world a better place. Enjoy watching. Here, high above the clouds, he could momentarily escape the pressures of his busy life. But little did Sebastian know, this flight would be anything but peaceful. As the last passengers boarded, an unexpected encounter was about to unfold, one that would test his character and change his perspective forever. The calm before the storm was about to end, ushering in a challenge that would alter the course of his day. As Sebastian settled into his comfortable first-class seat, he breathed a sigh of relief, allowing the stress of the day to melt away. He looked forward to a tranquil flight. However, his moment of calm was short-lived. Bethany, a flight attendant in her late 30s, with perfectly styled hair and a crisp uniform, approached Sebastian's seat. Her eyes narrowed as she looked him up and down, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Excuse me, sir," Bethany said, her voice sharp and cold. "I think you may have wandered into the wrong cabin. The economy section is further back." Sebastian looked up at her, surprised by her tone. He smiled politely. "No, ma'am, I'm in the right place. My seat is here." Just then, he stepped back toward his seat after using the lavatory, hoping to defuse the situation. Bethany's eyebrows shot up, disbelief clear on her face. She glanced around at the other passengers, who were now watching the exchange with interest. "I'm going to need to see your ticket," Bethany demanded, holding out her hand. Her voice dripped with skepticism. Sebastian felt a familiar ache in his chest. He had faced this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. Still, he kept his composure, refusing to let Bethany's rudeness affect him. With steady hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his ticket. He handed it to Bethany without a word, maintaining a calm and dignified demeanor. She snatched the ticket from his hand and held it up to the light, turning it this way and that, as if searching for a sign that it was fake. The other passengers watched in uncomfortable silence. "Is there a problem?" Sebastian asked quietly, his voice steady despite the humiliation of being questioned so publicly. Bethany's eyes flicked from the ticket to his face and back again. She seemed unable to believe that this man, dressed so simply and looking so out of place in her eyes, could actually belong in first class. "This ticket seems unusual," she said, her voice dripping with suspicion. "I'll need to verify it with the gate agent." Sebastian took a deep breath, fighting to maintain his composure. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some curious, others sympathetic. But he refused to let Bethany's behavior rattle him. "Take all the time you need," he said calmly. "I assure you, everything is in order." As Bethany stomped off to check his ticket, Sebastian closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about how far he had come, about the struggles he had faced and overcome. This was just another hurdle, another moment to show grace in the face of prejudice. When he opened his eyes and looked around at the other passengers, he offered them a small, reassuring smile. Sebastian knew that his dignity and calm in this moment spoke volumes, far more than any angry outburst ever could. When Bethany returned with Sebastian's ticket, her face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. She thrust the ticket back at him, her hand shaking slightly. "Well, it seems the ticket is valid," she said through gritted teeth. "But there must be some mistake. Surely you meant to book a seat in coach?" Sebastian took a deep breath, his patience wearing thin. He looked Bethany in the eye and spoke firmly but calmly. "There's no mistake, ma'am. This is my seat and I have every right to be here." Bethany's face turned an even deeper shade of red. She glanced around at the other passengers, who were now openly staring at the unfolding drama. "Sir, I must insist that you lower your voice," Bethany hissed. "You're being disrespectful to me and the other passengers in first class." Sebastian blinked in disbelief. He hadn't raised his voice at all. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say a word, Bethany's hand flew through the air and struck him across the face. The impact was shocking, leaving Sebastian momentarily stunned. The cabin fell silent, the atmosphere charged with tension. Bethany's eyes widened in surprise at her own reaction, while the other passengers gasped in disbelief. Sebastian touched his cheek, processing what had just happened. A mix of emotions swirled within him: anger, humiliation, but most of all, a deep sadness at the prejudice that still existed in the world. He took a breath, centering himself, and looked directly at Bethany. "Is this how you treat all your passengers?" he asked calmly, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain of how to react. Bethany opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, her gaze fell to the floor, shame washing over her. The gravity of her actions was sinking in, and in that moment, she realized she had crossed a line. Sebastian, feeling the weight of the moment, chose to rise above the situation. "I understand that you have a job to do, and that sometimes we all make mistakes," he said gently. "But I think we can do better than this." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted as passengers began to nod in agreement, some murmuring words of support. Sebastian's calm demeanor in the face of adversity resonated with those around him. It was a powerful reminder that kindness and understanding could triumph over hostility. Bethany, still flustered, looked up to meet his gaze again. This time, she saw not just a man in first class, but someone capable of forgiveness. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian offered a small smile, the warmth returning to his eyes. "Thank you. That means a lot." The tension in the cabin began to ease, and Bethany knew this was a turning point for her. The slap had opened her eyes to her own prejudices, and she realized that her actions had consequences far beyond that moment. As she walked away, Sebastian sat back in his seat, feeling a mix of relief and hope. This encounter had the potential to be a moment of reckoning for both of them. Sometimes a single moment of rashness can lead to a cascade of events that change lives forever, both for the one who strikes and the one who bears the mark. The sound of Bethany's slap echoed through the cabin. Sebastian's head jerked to the side from the force of her palm striking his cheek, and a collective gasp rose from the other passengers. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. He slowly turned his head back to face Bethany, his hand rising to touch his stinging cheek. Shock and hurt filled his wide eyes as he processed what had just happened. Bethany stood frozen, her hand still raised, disbelief written all over her face. The color drained from her cheeks as the reality of her actions sank in, leaving the cabin engulfed in stunned silence. Passengers looked on with open mouths and wide eyes, unable to comprehend the scene they had just witnessed. Some reached for their phones, while others whispered urgently to their seatmates. Sebastian sat very still, his dignified composure shaken for the first time since boarding the plane. He looked at Bethany, noticing the panic growing in her eyes as she realized the gravity of her mistake. Taking a deep breath, his cheek still stinging, he fixed his gaze on her, his eyes a mix of hurt and determination. "Why did you slap me?" he asked calmly, his voice barely above a whisper. Bethany's face flushed again, but she stood her ground. "You were being disrespectful," she insisted, her voice shaking slightly. "This is first class, and there are standards to maintain." Sebastian shook his head slowly, disbelief etched on his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a soft ping from his phone. Glancing down, he saw a message that made his eyebrows rise slightly. While Bethany continued to fume, Sebastian discreetly read the message, confirming that his company had just finalized the purchase of the airline's parent company, a deal he had been working on for months. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth as he put his phone away. As the plane began to taxi for takeoff, Sebastian pulled out his phone again, quickly typing a message to the airline's CEO, requesting an immediate internal investigation into Bethany's conduct. His fingers moved swiftly over the screen, outlining the incident in clear, concise terms. With the message sent, he leaned back in his seat, deciding to keep his new ownership of the airline to himself for now. There was no need to create a scene or draw more attention to the situation. Instead, he would set his plan in motion quietly, observing and gathering information. Throughout the flight, he kept a watchful eye on Bethany. He noticed how she avoided his section of the cabin, delegating tasks to other flight attendants whenever possible. When she did pass by his seat, her movements were stiff, her eyes darting nervously in his direction. Sebastian watched as Bethany interacted with other passengers, noting the differences in her behavior. She was polite but distant with most, overly attentive to a few, and noticeably less friendly to passengers of color. Each observation was carefully filed away in Sebastian's mind, forming a clearer picture of the woman who had so rashly judged him. As the flight progressed, Sebastian's mind worked on the changes he would implement. This incident, as unpleasant as it was, had given him a unique opportunity to witness firsthand the issues within the airline. He was determined to use this experience to create positive change, not just for himself, but for all passengers who might face similar discrimination. His heart sank as he witnessed another troubling incident unfold before him. An elderly black woman, her silver hair neatly tied back in a bun, struggled to lift her carry-on bag into the overhead compartment. She looked around, her eyes searching for assistance. "Excuse me," she called out softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Could I get some help, please?" Bethany was nearby, arranging items on her service cart. She glanced up, her eyes briefly meeting the older woman's pleading gaze. Sebastian's brow furrowed as he watched Bethany quickly look away, pretending not to have heard the request. Just then, a white passenger a few rows ahead raised his hand. "Miss, could I have another pillow?" he asked. In that moment, Sebastian felt a wave of frustration wash over him. It was as if the stark contrast between how Bethany treated different passengers laid bare the biases that still existed within the airline's culture. He couldn't let this pass. It was clear that Bethany needed a wake-up call, not just for her own sake, but for the sake of everyone she interacted with in her role as a flight attendant. The elderly woman's eyes fell, her hope for help fading as Bethany continued to ignore her. Sebastian made a decision. He would take a stand, not just for himself, but for that woman and for everyone who faced discrimination or disrespect in the air. He raised his voice, not in anger, but with calm authority. "Excuse me, Bethany," he called out, drawing her attention. The flight attendant turned toward him, a mix of surprise and irritation on her face. "Yes, sir?" she said, trying to maintain her composure. Sebastian gestured towards the elderly woman. "This lady needs help with her bag," he stated firmly. "It's your responsibility to assist all passengers, not just those who fit your idea of a first-class traveler." Bethany's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment it seemed as though she might push back. But the weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, and she realized she was no longer just facing Sebastian, but the collective gaze of the other passengers watching intently. "Of course," she replied, a tight smile plastered on her face. "I'll be right there." As she moved toward the elderly woman, Sebastian felt a small sense of victory. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but every small action mattered. He hoped that this moment would linger in Bethany's mind, sparking a shift in how she approached her role as a flight attendant. Watching her help the elderly woman with genuine care, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this experience would transform Bethany's perspective, not just today, but for the future. As the plane soared through the clouds, Sebastian settled back into his seat, contemplating the power of compassion and understanding in the face of prejudice. He was determined to create a culture of respect within the airline, one where everyone, regardless of their background, felt valued and cared for. This flight had become more than just a journey home. It was the beginning of a much larger mission, one that would echo far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Sometimes the true battles we fight aren't against individuals, but against a system that perpetuates inequality and discrimination. Bethany's demeanor changed instantly. A bright smile spread across her face as she hurried over to the man who had requested assistance. "Of course, sir. I'll get that for you right away," she chirped, her voice dripping with enthusiasm. Sebastian's jaw clenched as he watched the scene unfold. The contrast in Bethany's behavior was stark and undeniable. A deep sadness settled in his chest, not just for the elderly woman still struggling with her bag, but for the larger issue at hand. Unable to sit by and watch any longer, Sebastian stood up and made his way to the elderly woman. "May I help you with that, ma'am?" he asked gently. Gratitude shone in the woman's eyes as she nodded. "Oh, thank you, young man. These old bones aren't what they used to be." As Sebastian carefully lifted the bag into the compartment, he couldn't help but notice Bethany watching from the corner of her eye. Her face was a mix of emotions: embarrassment, defiance, and perhaps a hint of shame. Returning to his seat, Sebastian's mind raced. This incident had solidified his determination. It wasn't just about addressing Bethany's actions anymore. There were clearly deeper, systemic issues within the airline that needed tackling. He pulled out his tablet and began jotting down ideas: training programs on diversity and inclusion, revamping hiring practices, establishing clear protocols for assisting all passengers regardless of their appearance. The list grew longer as Sebastian's vision for transforming the airline's culture took shape. As the flight continued, he couldn't shake the troubling incidents he had witnessed. With a heavy heart, he pulled out his smartphone, determined to dig deeper into the airline's history. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen as he searched for information about past complaints or issues. What he found made his stomach churn. Page after page of complaints about discriminatory practices from flight staff popped up. Sebastian's eyes widened as he scrolled through the seemingly endless list. Many of these complaints had been either dismissed or given only a cursory response. "This can't be right," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. As he delved further, a familiar name caught his eye: Bethany. There were multiple complaints specifically mentioning her. Sebastian's jaw clenched as he read the details. Passengers of color being ignored or treated rudely, elderly travelers left without assistance, and even instances of outright hostility toward those who didn't fit Bethany's narrow view of a first-class passenger. One particularly heartbreaking complaint stood out. A young mother traveling with her mixed-race child had been subjected to Bethany's cruel comments and dismissive behavior. The woman's words leapt off the screen. "I felt humiliated and angry. My child asked me why the lady didn't like us. How do you explain that to a 5-year-old?" Sebastian's eyes stung with unshed tears as he thought of his own experiences growing up, the countless times he had faced similar treatment. He had hoped things would be different now, but clearly there was still so much work to be done. As he continued to read, Sebastian realized that the problem extended beyond just one flight attendant. The sheer number of complaints and the airline's inadequate responses pointed to a much larger systemic issue. This was a cultural problem that had festered and grown over time. Sebastian's resolve strengthened with each passing minute. He knew that simply addressing Bethany's behavior wouldn't be enough. The entire airline needed a complete overhaul of its policies, training, and corporate culture. He began making notes on his phone, his mind racing with ideas for sweeping changes. Mandatory sensitivity training for all staff, a complete revision of the complaint handling process, and the implementation of a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior were just the beginning. As Sebastian looked up from his phone, his gaze fell on Bethany, who was serving drinks to passengers a few rows ahead. He saw her now not just as an individual who had wronged him, but as a symptom of a much larger problem. His heart felt heavy, but his determination burned brighter than ever. Leaning back in his first-class seat, Sebastian's mind whirred with ideas. He knew that addressing the airline's problems would require more than just a quick fix. It would take time, persistence, and a commitment to real change. This flight was just the beginning of his journey, a journey toward transforming not only an airline, but also the lives of everyone who flew with it, ensuring they would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. He resolved to make his voice heard, not just for himself, but for every passenger who had ever felt marginalized, overlooked, or disrespected. The battle was far from over, but he was ready to fight. Sometimes, real change requires not just accountability, but a heartfelt commitment to understanding and growth. With a deep breath, Sebastian began to sketch out a multi-layered approach for reform. First on his list was a company-wide mandate for empathy and cultural sensitivity training. He believed education was key to changing hearts and minds. He envisioned a program that would open eyes and foster understanding among all employees, from the CEO down to the baggage handlers. "We need to start from the ground up," he murmured to himself, jotting down notes on his phone. He decided to focus especially on flight attendants like Bethany, who interacted most closely with passengers. These frontline staff members were the face of the airline, and their behavior could make or break a traveler's experience. Sebastian's plan began to take shape. He would launch the initiative quietly, without fanfare or public announcements. This wasn't about scoring points or making headlines. It was about real, lasting change. As he looked around the cabin, Sebastian's gaze lingered on Bethany. He felt a mix of emotions: anger at her actions, sadness for the pain she had caused, but also a glimmer of hope. Maybe with the right guidance and education, even someone like Bethany could learn and grow. Sebastian knew that simply disciplining Bethany wouldn't be enough. It might satisfy his immediate desire for justice, but it wouldn't solve the deeper issues plaguing the airline. No, he needed to do more. He imagined a series of workshops where employees could share their experiences and learn from one another. He pictured team-building exercises that would break down barriers and foster empathy, and he saw a future where every employee, from the pilots to the gate agents, understood the importance of treating all passengers with respect and dignity. As the flight continued, Sebastian felt a sense of purpose growing within him. This was more than just a business decision. It was a chance to make a real difference in people's lives. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready for the journey. As the plane touched down, Sebastian remained in his seat, allowing other passengers to disembark first. He watched as Bethany bustled about, assisting travelers with their belongings, her demeanor noticeably more pleasant towards certain passengers than others. With a quiet sigh, Sebastian gathered his things and made his way off the aircraft. He nodded politely to the crew, including Bethany, who barely acknowledged him. As he walked through the jet bridge, he pulled out his phone and sent a brief message to his team. "Begin the process. Discretion is key." In the days that followed, Sebastian's acquisition of the airline remained under wraps. The internal investigation into Bethany's conduct began quietly. with HR representatives discreetly interviewing passengers and crew members who had witnessed the incident. Meanwhile, Sebastian's team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, drafting new policies and training programs. They pored over employee handbooks, diversity guidelines, and customer service protocols, determined to create a comprehensive plan for change. Bethany, oblivious to the storm brewing around her, continued her daily routine. She arrived at work each day, donning her uniform with pride and greeting her colleagues with a smile. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. She believed she was simply upholding the standards of first-class service. During a coffee break, Bethany chatted with a coworker about the incident. "Can you believe that man?" she scoffed. "Trying to make me look bad for doing my job? Some people just don't understand how things work up here in first class." Her coworker shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, aware of the whispers circulating about an ongoing investigation. As the days passed, Sebastian received regular updates on the progress of both the investigation and the policy drafts. He reviewed each report carefully, making notes and suggestions. His vision for a more inclusive and respectful airline was slowly taking shape. In one meeting, Sebastian emphasized to his team, "We're not just changing rules on paper. We're aiming to transform the entire culture of this airline. It's about creating an environment where every employee and passenger feels valued and respected." Bethany's day started like any other. She arrived at the airport, her uniform crisp and her hair neatly pinned back. She went through her usual routines, greeting colleagues and preparing for the day's flights. But as she moved through the terminal, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Whispers surrounded her. Hushed conversations seemed to stop when she approached. Bethany dismissed it as typical airport gossip. Little did she know that her actions had sparked a series of events that would change her life and the airline forever. As the morning wore on, Bethany noticed a few new faces in the break room, HR representatives she hadn't seen before. They seemed to be talking to her coworkers in a serious manner. Her heart began to race. Was it about the incident? But she shook her head, trying to quell the rising tide of anxiety. Surely, it couldn't be that serious. As she headed towards the gate for her first flight, she spotted Sebastian in the distance, speaking with a group of employees. He looked composed, but she could sense an undercurrent of intensity in the way he carried himself. Bethany's gut tightened. She couldn't help but feel that she was at the center of a storm, even if she didn't fully understand why. As she prepared for boarding, Sebastian's voice carried through the terminal, discussing plans for a new training initiative that would be rolling out soon. The words empathy and cultural sensitivity echoed ominously in her mind. In that moment, Bethany began to realize that the winds of change were blowing through the airline, and she might just be swept up in them. Sometimes facing the truth means confronting the very essence of who you thought you were. As Bethany walked through the employee entrance, she noticed a few coworkers glancing her way and whispering. She shrugged it off, assuming they were just gossiping about the latest office drama. But when she reached her locker, an envelope was waiting for her. Bethany frowned, tearing it open. Her eyes widened as she read the contents. "Mandatory training session on cultural sensitivity," she muttered under her breath. "You've got to be kidding me." She crumpled the notice in her hand, her cheeks flushing with anger. She had been a flight attendant for over a decade. She knew how to do her job, and she did it well. The very idea that she needed sensitivity training felt like a slap in the face. Throughout her shift, the notice weighed heavily on her mind. As she served drinks and handed out pillows, Bethany couldn't shake the feeling of indignation. She had always prided herself on maintaining the high standards of first-class service. How dare they suggest I need to change my approach? During her break, Bethany vented to her friend and fellow flight attendant, Lisa. "Can you believe this?" she fumed, waving the crumpled notice. "They're making me go to some ridiculous sensitivity training, as if I don't know how to treat passengers properly." Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Maybe it's not such a bad idea, Beth. You know, sometimes we all need a refresher on these things." Bethany stared at her friend in disbelief. "Are you saying I'm insensitive?" No, Lisa backpedaled. "I just mean, well, times are changing. Maybe the airline wants to make sure we're all on the same page. But Bethany wasn't having it. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I don't need to be on any page. I know how to do my job, and I do it well. This is just a waste of time. As she stormed out of the break room, Bethany's mind raced with defiant thoughts. She'd go to this training, sure, but she'd make it clear that she didn't need it. She'd show them all that Bethany Williams was a model flight attendant, one who didn't need any lectures on how to treat passengers. Little did Bethany know, her resistance to change was about to be put to the test in ways she never imagined. As the sun rose over the city skyline, Sebastian Dixon sat in his newly acquired office at the airline's headquarters. His eyes were focused on the computer screen before him, filled with page after page of passenger complaints. He scrolled through them slowly, his brow furrowing with each new report of discriminatory behavior. This goes deeper than I thought, Sebastian muttered to himself, shaking his head. He had spent the last few days reviewing not just Bethany's record, but those of other flight attendants and staff members as well. The pattern was clear. Complaints of unfair treatment based on race, age, and appearance had been piling up for years, with little to no action taken. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, his mind working on solutions. He knew that mandatory training was just the first step to truly change the airline's culture. He needed to create a system where every voice could be heard. With determination in his eyes, Sebastian picked up his phone and dialed his chief of operations. "Sarah, I need you to set up a meeting with our tech team," he said. "We're going to implement an anonymous feedback system for our passengers." Over the next few hours, Sebastian worked tirelessly with his team to design a user-friendly app. Passengers would be able to rate their experience and provide detailed feedback, all without fear of retaliation. The data would be collected and analyzed, allowing Sebastian to identify problem areas and address them swiftly. As the day wore on, Sebastian's focus shifted to the complaints against Bethany. He read through each one carefully, noting the similarities in her behavior across different incidents. It was clear that her actions weren't isolated events, but part of a deeply ingrained attitude. "We can't just punish her," Sebastian said to his HR director during a late afternoon meeting. "We need to give her a chance to understand and change." His vision was becoming clearer. It wasn't just about making Bethany aware of her shortcomings. It was about creating a culture where accountability went hand in hand with growth. Sebastian knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was committed to the process. He scheduled a meeting with Bethany, hoping to create an environment where she felt safe enough to express her concerns and reflect on her actions. In the days leading up to the training session, Sebastian frequently checked in with the tech team as they prepared to launch the feedback app. He envisioned it as a tool for not just monitoring staff behavior, but also as a means of empowerment for passengers who often felt unheard. This was how we would begin to reshape the culture of the airline. Meanwhile, Bethany was gearing up for her mandatory training with a stubborn resolve. She practiced her defiance in front of the mirror, determined to walk into that session with her head held high. "I won't let them make me feel less than," she told herself. "I've earned my place here." But deep down, a small voice nagged at her, whispering doubts she didn't want to acknowledge. What if the training actually had merit? What if there was something she didn't see? As she prepared for the day ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that change was in the air, and not just for her colleagues, but for herself too. As the day of the training approached, Sebastian felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. He was hopeful that the session would serve as a turning point, not just for Bethany, but for the entire airline. As he stood before the group, ready to address his staff, he knew that the journey to transformation was just beginning. Little did they all realize, the real test of their resolve was about to unfold. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. Together, they drafted a personalized improvement plan for Bethany. It included not just sensitivity training, but also one-on-one mentoring sessions and community outreach programs. Sebastian hoped that by exposing Bethany to diverse experiences, she might begin to see the world through a different lens. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his office, Sebastian reviewed the day's work. The anonymous feedback system was in development, the training programs were being expanded, and plans were in place to address individual cases like Bethany's. He knew that changing an entire company's culture wouldn't happen overnight. But as he looked out over the city, he felt a sense of hope. With patience, persistence, and compassion, he believed he could transform the airline into a model of inclusivity and respect. On a crisp Monday morning, Bethany arrived at the airline's training center, her lips pursed in a tight line. She glanced at her watch, sighing heavily as she pushed open the glass doors. The lobby was bustling with other flight attendants, all gathered for the mandatory cultural sensitivity training. What a waste of time, Bethany muttered under her breath as she signed in at the reception desk. The training room was set up with circular tables, each surrounded by 6 chairs. Bethany chose a seat near the back, crossing her arms as she settled in. She barely acknowledged the other attendants who joined her table, her eyes fixed on the clock on the wall. As the trainer, a cheerful woman named Mina, began the session, Bethany's indifference was palpable. She slouched in her chair, her eyes glazed over as Lisa explained the importance of cultural awareness in their line of work. Today, we'll be exploring different scenarios and discussing how to handle them with empathy and respect, Mina announced. Her enthusiasm met with Bethany's eye roll. When Mina asked the group to share experiences of cultural misunderstandings, Bethany remained silent. She doodled on her notepad, occasionally glancing at her phone under the table. "Bethany, would you like to share your thoughts?" Mina asked, noticing her disengagement. Bethany looked up, startled. "I don't really have anything to add," she said flatly. "I've always done my job just fine." Mina nodded, her smile unwavering. "Well, there's always room for growth and learning, isn't there?" Bethany shrugged, returning to her doodles. She missed the concerned glances exchanged between Mina and her assistant, who was discreetly operating a camera at the back of the room. As the session progressed, the group engaged in role-playing exercises. Bethany participated minimally, her responses curt and dismissive. When asked to demonstrate how she would handle a non-English-speaking passenger, she sighed heavily. "I'd just speak louder and slower," Bethany said, her tone laced with impatience. "That usually works." Mina gently suggested alternative approaches, but Bethany waved them off. "Look, we can't bend over backwards for every single person," she said. "Sometimes they just need to adapt to our way of doing things." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Bethany, oblivious to the impact of her words, checked her watch again. She couldn't wait for this politically correct nonsense to be over. As the session drew to a close, Mina asked each participant to share one thing they'd learned. When it was Bethany's turn, she shrugged. "I guess I learned that we're supposed to walk on eggshells now," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Wouldn't want to offend anyone by doing our jobs." Mina's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Thank you for your honesty, Bethany," she said. "I hope that as you reflect on today's session, you'll find more positive takeaways." Bethany gathered her things, eager to leave. She failed to notice the assistant packing up the camera equipment, the lens having captured every moment of her resistance throughout the day. Meanwhile, Sebastian sat in his office, his fingers steepled under his chin as he pored over Bethany's personnel file. The more he read, the more he realized there was more to the story than just a rude flight attendant. He murmured, leaning back in his chair. The complaints against Bethany formed a complex tapestry of behavior shaped by her own experiences, insecurities, and biases. Sebastian's heart sank as he recalled the pattern. Years of disregard for passengers' needs, rooted in an upbringing that likely reinforced the very notions she clung to. He knew Bethany's actions were symptomatic of a broader issue, one that couldn't be resolved with mere training. It was clear that to inspire genuine change, he needed to confront not just Bethany's behavior, but also the belief systems that drove her actions. He picked up his phone and called Sarah, his chief of operations. "I want to arrange for Bethany to participate in community outreach programs," he said. "Let's give her a chance to meet passengers from different backgrounds, people she wouldn't typically interact with in her day-to-day routine." "Are you sure that's wise?" Sarah asked, hesitating. She might resist even more. "I believe exposure is key," Sebastian replied firmly. If we want her to change, she needs to see beyond her narrow worldview. With Sarah on board, Sebastian began drafting a series of outreach initiatives, aiming to connect flight attendants with diverse communities. He envisioned immersive experiences that would challenge their preconceived notions and encourage them to embrace empathy. As the days turned into weeks, Bethany continued to attend the training sessions, her resistance slowly transforming into a quiet contemplation. She still rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath, but something about the discussions began to chip away at her defiance. The participants shared stories of discrimination and misunderstanding, and slowly, Bethany started to realize that perhaps her approach needed to evolve. Meanwhile, Sebastian remained vigilant, constantly monitoring the feedback from passengers through the new app. He began to see improvements in overall ratings, but Bethany's name still surfaced, a constant reminder of the work that lay ahead. Change doesn't happen overnight, he thought, reminding himself of the long road to transformation. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was committed to seeing it through. Back at the training center, Mina noticed a subtle shift in Bethany's demeanor. After weeks of engaging in group discussions and role-playing exercises, Bethany began asking questions. "Can you explain why some passengers might feel offended?" she asked one day, her tone more inquisitive than defensive. Mina smiled, encouraged by the change. "Absolutely, Bethany. It's all about understanding different perspectives. Every passenger brings their own experiences with them, and those can shape their expectations and reactions." With each new discussion, Bethany found herself reflecting more on her own experiences and biases. For the first time, she began to understand that her actions impacted more than just her immediate environment. They influenced the broader culture of the airline. As the outreach programs launched, Sebastian watched with anticipation. He hoped these initiatives would catalyze change not just in Bethany, but across the entire airline. As for Bethany, she was about to embark on a journey that would challenge her beliefs and ultimately reshape her understanding of what it meant to serve others. Little did she know, this would be a turning point not just for her career, but for her personal growth as well. In a world where actions can lead to unforeseen consequences, what happens when a seemingly perfect professional faces the reality of their own biases? He closed the file and gazed out the window, his mind working overtime. "It's not just about punishing her," he said to himself. "It's about breaking the cycle." Sebastian picked up his phone and dialed his head of human resources. "Janet, I've been thinking about that pilot program we discussed, the one about addressing prejudice in the workplace." "Yes, Mr. Dixon," Janet replied. "We're still in the early stages." "I want to fast-track it," Sebastian said, his voice firm but kind. "And I have our first participant in mind." He explained his findings about Bethany and his desire to include her in the program. Janet listened intently, occasionally asking questions. "Are you sure, sir?" she asked when he finished. Given her recent actions, some might see this as too lenient. Sebastian smiled, though Janet couldn't see it through the phone. "Sometimes, Janet, the people who need help the most are the ones who don't even know they need it." After hanging up, Sebastian leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of hope and determination. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Bethany's prejudices were deeply ingrained, formed over years in a community that reinforced them. But he also knew the power of education and exposure to different perspectives. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow," he said softly, picking up a framed photo on his desk. It showed a younger version of himself, standing proudly in front of his first successful business venture. "Lord knows I had my share of second chances." Sebastian began jotting down ideas for the program. It would need to be comprehensive, addressing not just workplace behavior, but the root causes of prejudice. He envisioned workshops, one-on-one counseling sessions, and even community outreach programs. As he worked, Sebastian felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about changing one person or one airline. It was about creating a ripple effect that could touch countless lives. The next day, Bethany walked into the staff lounge, her head held high despite the gnawing feeling in her stomach as she approached the coffee machine. She noticed a group of her coworkers huddled together, whispering. When they saw her, they quickly dispersed, avoiding eye contact. "Morning, Bethany," she said, trying to sound cheerful. No one responded. She poured her coffee, her hand shaking slightly. This had been happening more and more lately. People were acting strange around her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As she stirred her coffee, her supervisor, Mark, entered the room. "Bethany, can I see you in my office when you have a moment?" Bethany's heart raced. "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile. In Mark's office, the tension was palpable. He cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Bethany, I've received some concerns about your recent conduct on flights." Bethany's face flushed. "Concerns? What do you mean?" Mark shifted in his seat. "There have been reports of, well, let's say, less than professional behavior towards certain passengers." Bethany felt her defenses rise. "I always maintain the highest standards in first class. If passengers can't meet those standards, that's hardly my fault." Mark's expression hardened. "Bethany, we're not talking about standards here. We're talking about how you treat people." As she left Mark's office, Bethany felt like the walls were closing in. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had always prided herself on doing her job well, on maintaining order in her cabin. Over the next few days, Bethany noticed more changes. Her regular flying partners suddenly had schedule conflicts. She was assigned to different routes, working with unfamiliar crews who seemed to watch her every move. One afternoon, as she was checking the passenger manifest for her next flight, she overheard two flight attendants talking in hushed tones. "Did you hear about Bethany?" one whispered. "Yeah, I heard there's an investigation, something about discrimination." Bethany froze, her heart pounding. An investigation? Discrimination? The words echoed in her mind, making her feel dizzy. As she boarded the plane for her next flight, Bethany felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. For the first time in years, she doubted herself. Had she really done something wrong? Were her actions really discriminatory? Bethany found herself second-guessing every interaction. When a passenger asked for help with their bag, she hesitated, wondering if her response would be scrutinized. Would they see me as unhelpful, she thought, her stomach churning. She walked through the cabin, her smile faltering as she poured drinks and passed out snacks. She could feel the eyes of her coworkers on her, weighing her every action. Each interaction felt like a performance, a test she wasn't sure she could pass. After the flight, she overheard a conversation between two of her colleagues. "I don't know how she thought she could get away with that behavior," one said. "We all know it's not acceptable." Bethany's heart sank. How could they think that about me? She wanted to yell, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she forced a smile and continued to work, feeling increasingly isolated. When she returned home that evening, she collapsed onto her couch, overwhelmed. The weight of her colleagues' judgment felt unbearable. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but instead she sat in silence staring at the wall. Was it really me? The thought plagued her as she replayed interactions in her mind. Had she truly treated passengers unfairly? What if everything she had believed about herself was a lie? In the following days, as she continued to work under the scrutiny of her peers, Bethany felt a flicker of something new creeping in. Self-reflection. The whispers of doubt began to take root in her mind, and she found herself questioning the very principles she had held on to so fiercely. "Maybe there's more to this than I thought," she mused one evening, her mind wandering back to the training sessions. Sebastian's initiative loomed in the background, waiting for her to take a step forward. Perhaps it was time to embrace the discomfort, to seek understanding instead of pushing against it. With a deep breath, Bethany picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She paused at Lisa's name, her heart racing. Maybe it was time to reach out for support, to have an honest conversation about what was happening. As she pressed call, she felt a mix of fear and hope. Could she truly begin to break free from the cycle that had ensnared her for so long? In the spotlight of accountability, can one flight attendant confront her past mistakes and forge a new path forward? When she served drinks, Bethany worried about the order in which she approached passengers. By the end of the flight, she was exhausted. The constant self-doubt and worry had taken their toll. As she gathered her things to leave, she caught sight of her reflection in a window. The confident, assured flight attendant she once knew seemed to have disappeared. replaced by someone uncertain and afraid. Sebastian sat in his office, his eyes fixed on the computer screen before him. He had been monitoring Bethany's progress in the training program for weeks now, carefully reviewing every interaction and report. "How's she doing?" asked his assistant Loretta, as she brought him a fresh cup of coffee. Sebastian sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's hard to say. There are moments when I think she's getting it." But then, he clicked through a series of video clips, each showing Bethany in different training scenarios. In one, she seemed genuinely engaged, asking thoughtful questions about cultural sensitivity. In another, her body language screamed discomfort and resistance. "It's like she's fighting against herself," Sebastian mused. "She wants to change, but her old habits are deeply ingrained." Loretta nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. "What's your next move?" Sebastian leaned back in his chair, his face set in determination. "I think it's time to push her harder. She needs to confront her past behavior head-on." He pulled up a document on his screen outlining the next phase of the program. "Public acknowledgement," he said, tapping the screen. "It's a risky move, but I believe it's necessary." The plan was bold. Bethany would be asked to address her colleagues and some of the passengers she had mistreated, openly discussing her past mistakes and the lessons she had learned. "Are you sure about this, Sebastian?" Loretta asked, concern evident in her voice. "It could backfire." Sebastian nodded slowly. "I know it's a gamble, but Bethany needs this push. She's been hiding behind her defenses for too long. It's time for her to face the truth about her actions." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling airport below. This is her chance to show real growth, to prove that she's capable of change. If she can do this, it won't just help her. It could inspire others in the company to examine their own biases. Loretta watched him, admiring his commitment to this cause. "And if she can't?" Sebastian turned back to face her, his expression serious. "Then we'll know we've done everything we could. But I have hope for Bethany. I've seen glimpses of the person she could be." He returned to his desk and picked up his phone. "It's time to set this in motion. Let's schedule a meeting with the training coordinators. We need to prepare Bethany for what's coming." As Sebastian began dialing, he felt the weight of his decision. He knew that this next step would be challenging for Bethany, pushing her to her limits. But he also believed it was necessary, not just for her, but for the entire airline. Bethany's hands trembled as she read the email on her phone. Her heart raced, and she felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. The next training session wasn't just another meeting. It was going to be live-streamed to every single employee in the company. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the empty break room. "This can't be happening." She scrolled through the email again, hoping she had misread it. But there it was, in black and white. "Your next session will be broadcast live as part of our company-wide initiative for transparency and growth." Bethany's mind raced with panic. Everyone would be watching her, her colleagues, her superiors, even the new owners of the airline. And worst of all, she'd have to talk about that day. The day she'd confronted the passenger who turned out to be Sebastian Dixon. As the days passed, Bethany's anxiety grew. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying the incident in her mind. The memory of her actions made her cringe with shame. "What was I thinking?" she muttered to herself as she tossed and turned in bed. "How could I have been so blind?" The night before the live stream session, Bethany sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by notes and talking points. She had been trying to prepare, to find the right words to explain herself, but everything she wrote felt hollow and inadequate. "I can't do this," she said, pushing away from the table in frustration. "I can't face all those people and admit how wrong I was." But as much as she wanted to run away from it all, Bethany knew she had no choice. This was her chance to show that she had learned from her mistakes. It was her opportunity to prove that she could change. With shaking hands, she picked up her pen again and started writing. This time, instead of excuses, she focused on the truth. She wrote about her prejudices, her misguided assumptions, and the harm she had caused. "Dear colleagues," she began, "I stand before you today, not as someone who is proud of my past actions, but as someone who is learning and growing. I want to take this opportunity to reflect on a specific incident that opened my eyes to the impact of my words and behavior. She continued, pouring her heart into the page as she recounted her experiences, not shying away from the uncomfortable truths. The more she wrote, the lighter she felt. With each stroke of the pen, Bethany began to confront the shadows of her past. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Bethany found herself immersed in a cathartic process. She shared her fear of being judged, her struggle with the change, and her hope for the future. By the time she finished, she felt as though she had laid a piece of her soul bare. Looking over her notes, she whispered, "This is who I need to be. This is my truth." With a sense of resolve, Bethany prepared for the next day, knowing she had a difficult journey ahead, but one that could lead to real change, not just for herself, but for everyone watching. Tomorrow, she would take the first step towards accountability and growth, and perhaps, in the process, inspire others to do the same. Bethany felt a knot tightening in her stomach as the elderly woman's words hung in the air. The memories rushed back, images of her own behavior flashing before her like a slideshow of regret. She had let her biases dictate her actions, and now she was confronted with the painful reality of how those actions had impacted others. The room was silent as the elderly woman continued. "I was scared to fly, and I just wanted someone to see me, to treat me with kindness. Instead, I felt invisible." Tears welled in Bethany's eyes, and she looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of her past choices pressed heavily on her chest, threatening to suffocate her. She was reminded of how she had treated Sebastian, how her assumptions had cost her not just a passenger's dignity, but also her own integrity. After the elderly woman finished, the audience erupted into applause, a mixture of empathy and solidarity rippling through the room. Sebastian stood, his expression serious yet compassionate. "Thank you for sharing your experiences. It takes tremendous courage to speak out, and your voices are vital to our commitment to change." Bethany watched as Sebastian took control of the room, channeling the energy from the emotional stories into a call for action. "This isn't just about policies, it's about people. We need to listen and learn from our mistakes. We must ensure that every passenger feels valued and respected, regardless of their background." As he spoke, Bethany felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. Maybe there was a path forward, a chance to redeem herself, not only in her own eyes, but in the eyes of the people she had wronged. But she also knew that it wouldn't be easy. Redemption required more than just words. It required consistent action. Sebastian paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience, then resting on Bethany. "I want to invite Bethany to share her journey with us today." The words were both a surprise and a challenge. All eyes turned to her, and the room fell into a hushed silence. Bethany's heart raced as she stood up, her legs trembling. She slowly walked to the microphone, the spotlight feeling both intimidating and illuminating. She took a deep breath, remembering the weight of the stories she had just heard. "Thank you, Sebastian," she began, her voice shaky yet resolute. "I stand before you today with a heavy heart. I've made mistakes, serious ones, and I can't take back what I've done. But I'm here to acknowledge those mistakes and to commit to change." As she continued, Bethany shared her own experiences, her journey through prejudice, and the painful realizations that had come with it. She spoke candidly about her actions toward Sebastian and the lessons she had learned through the training program. "I'm committed to understanding and confronting my biases," she declared, her voice gaining strength. "I want to be part of a solution, to help ensure that no one feels the way I made them feel." The audience was silent, absorbing her words, and for the first time Bethany felt a sense of authenticity in her voice. "I can't undo the hurt I caused," she continued, "but I promise to do the work, to listen, to learn, and to be better. I hope that my journey can serve as a reminder that change is possible and that it starts with acknowledging our failures." When she finished, the room erupted into applause once more, this time louder and filled with encouragement. Bethany felt the warmth of acceptance wash over her. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step toward healing, a recognition that she was no longer defined by her past, but by her willingness to change. Sebastian stepped back to the front, his expression proud. "Thank you, Bethany. What you've shared is incredibly important, and it's a testament to the power of vulnerability in the face of our mistakes. As the forum concluded, Bethany felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. She understood that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, she felt equipped to face them. She was ready to rebuild her reputation, not just as a flight attendant, but as a person committed to growth. Days turned into weeks, and as Bethany continued her training, she engaged in conversations that challenged her perspective. Each discussion pushed her to confront her biases, and she found herself gaining new insights not just about herself, but about the world around her. She learned from her colleagues, listening to their stories, and realized that everyone had a unique journey, one that deserved respect and understanding. One afternoon, as Bethany finished a workshop, she caught Sebastian in the hallway. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice sincere, "for believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Sebastian smiled warmly. "You did the hard work, Bethany. You took a chance, and it's paying off. Remember, change is a continuous journey. Keep pushing yourself." With a newfound sense of purpose, Bethany nodded. She was ready to embrace her role, not just as a flight attendant, but as an advocate for change. She was committed to ensuring that every passenger felt seen, valued, and respected. As the weeks passed, Bethany found herself thriving in her job. She established strong connections with her colleagues and earned the trust of the passengers she served. Her transformation wasn't just about her actions. It was about the ripple effect of her commitment to change. And in those moments of genuine connection with passengers, when she listened to their stories, offered assistance with a smile, or simply acknowledged their presence, Bethany felt a sense of fulfillment that she had never experienced before. She realized that while her past would always be a part of her story, it no longer defined her. In the heart of the airline, she had found her voice. A voice dedicated to breaking the cycle of prejudice, one interaction at a time. And as she soared through the skies, she carried with her the lessons of empathy and understanding, ready to make a difference, not just in her life but in the lives of everyone around her. Sebastian smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I believe you, Bethany. Change isn't an overnight process, but every step you take is important. I want you to lead the next training session on bias awareness. It's time for you to share your story and help others understand the impact of their actions." Bethany's heart raced at the prospect. "Me? Lead a training session?" she stammered, uncertainty creeping back in. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "You're more ready than you think," Sebastian encouraged. "You have the experience, and now you have the insight. Your honesty today has already resonated with so many. You can turn your pain into something powerful that can inspire real change." Taking a deep breath, Bethany considered his words. "Okay," she said slowly. "I'll do it. I want to make a difference." "Great," Sebastian replied, his enthusiasm infectious. "Let's work together on the curriculum. You can incorporate the passengers' stories we heard today. They'll serve as powerful reminders of why we must address our biases." As they discussed the plans for the training, Bethany felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was her chance to not only redeem herself, but also to facilitate change in her colleagues. She was ready to take this opportunity and turn it into a catalyst for growth. Over the following weeks, Bethany immersed herself in preparing for the training session. She spoke with colleagues, researched effective methods for discussing biases, and even reached out to some of the passengers who had shared their stories during the forum. Their willingness to help only fueled her resolve. Finally, the day of the training arrived. Bethany stood at the front of the room, surrounded by her peers, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath and glanced at the faces before her. Some were familiar, others not, but they all shared a common goal: to improve their service and understanding. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steadier than she had anticipated. "I'm here to share my journey with you. My hope is that by being vulnerable, we can learn from one another and foster a more inclusive environment for both our passengers and ourselves." As she spoke, Bethany shared her story, the biases she had carried, the incident with Sebastian, and the profound realization she had experienced in the wake of her actions. She incorporated the passengers' stories, emphasizing the importance of empathy and awareness. "You may not think your actions matter," she said passionately, "but they do. Every small interaction counts. We have the power to uplift or diminish someone's experience, and it's our responsibility to choose the former." The room was silent, the weight of her words resonating deeply. She could see the impact she was having: nodding heads, furrowed brows, and even a few teary eyes. As the session progressed, Bethany facilitated open discussions, encouraging her colleagues to share their thoughts and experiences. The atmosphere shifted from discomfort to openness, with participants reflecting on their own biases and how they could actively work to combat them. At the end of the training, Bethany felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. The session had sparked meaningful conversations, and she could see her colleagues genuinely reconsidering their perspectives. As the attendees began to leave, Sebastian approached her with a proud smile. "You did an incredible job today, Bethany. I knew you had it in you." "Thank you," she replied, her heart swelling with pride. "I feel like we really connected today. I hope this will lead to lasting change." "I believe it will," Sebastian said, his expression serious. "This is just the beginning. We'll need to continue these conversations and implement regular training sessions to ensure we're holding ourselves accountable." Over the next few months, Bethany worked alongside Sebastian and the training team to establish ongoing workshops and discussions focused on bias awareness and inclusion. The initiative garnered attention, leading to increased participation from staff members who wanted to learn and grow. Bethany found herself thriving in her role, her confidence steadily increasing as she embraced her newfound purpose. With each session, she felt more empowered to lead and advocate for change within the airline. One day, as she was reviewing feedback from a recent training session, she received an unexpected email from one of the passengers she had reached out to for assistance. The subject line read, "Thank you for listening." With a sense of curiosity, Bethany opened the email and read the heartfelt message. The passenger expressed gratitude for the airline's commitment to addressing biases and shared how her experience had inspired her to speak out against discrimination in her own community. As she finished reading, tears of joy streamed down Bethany's face. It was moments like these that reinforced her belief in the power of change. She realized that her journey was not just about her redemption. It was about making a difference for others who had experienced the same pain she once had inflicted. In the following weeks, as the airline continued to make strides in fostering an inclusive environment, Bethany became a key figure in the initiative. Her passion and dedication inspired others to take action, creating a ripple effect that transcended the company. Sebastian often reminded her, "Change is not easy, but it's always worth it." And with each passing day, Bethany proved that she was not only capable of change, but also a catalyst for change. She embraced her role as an advocate, her journey evolving into a mission to uplift others and promote understanding within the industry. As she stood at the front of the training room one day, addressing a new group of employees, she felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. The path had been challenging, but every step had brought her closer to her true self. "Thank you for being here today," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Together, we can create a culture of compassion and respect. Let's commit to making a difference, one interaction at a time." And as she looked out at the eager faces before her, she knew that change was possible. It started with one person daring to confront their past, and now it was a collective effort, one that would reshape the airline for generations to come. Sebastian smiled warmly. "I believe you, Bethany. Now let's work together to make this airline a place where everyone feels welcome and respected." Sebastian took a deep breath, his eyes still fixed on Bethany. "I have a proposition for you," he said, his voice calm but firm. Bethany looked up, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "A proposition?" she echoed. Sebastian nodded. "I'd like to offer you a position as a leader in our new cultural sensitivity initiative." Bethany's jaw dropped. Of all the things she had expected, this wasn't one of them. "Me? But why?" she stammered. "Because you've lived it," Sebastian explained. "You've experienced firsthand how deeply ingrained biases can affect our actions, and now you're learning to overcome them." Bethany listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. Let me be clear, Sebastian continued, his tone serious. This isn't a reward, it's an opportunity, a chance to make amends by helping others learn from your mistakes. Bethany nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what Sebastian was offering. It wasn't just a job, it was a responsibility. You'll work directly with our training team, Sebastian explained. You'll share your story, lead discussions, and help develop new programs to address discrimination within our company. As Sebastian spoke, Bethany felt a shift inside her. The shame she had been carrying began to transform into something else. A determination to do better, to be better. I don't know what to say, Bethany said softly. I'm honored that you trust me with this after everything that's happened. Sebastian smiled gently. It's not about trust, Bethany. It's about growth. You've shown that you're capable of change. Now I'm asking you to help others do the same. Bethany took a deep breath, feeling the enormity of the task ahead. But instead of fear, she felt a sense of purpose. I accept, she said, her voice stronger now. I want to make things right. Sebastian nodded approvingly. Good. But remember, this journey isn't just about changing others. It's about continuing to change yourself. Bethany understood. She knew that her transformation was far from complete. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and difficulty, but for the first time in a long time she felt truly hopeful. I'm ready, Bethany said, her voice filled with newfound determination. I promise to approach this with humility and compassion. I know I still have a lot to learn, but I'm committed to doing better, for myself, for our past passengers, and for the entire airline. Sebastian smiled, seeing the sincerity in Bethany's eyes. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he believed in the power of second chances. In that moment, watching Bethany's transformation, he felt confident that real change was possible. Bethany stepped into the conference room, her heart racing. It was her first day in her new role, and she felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Sebastian stood at the front of the room, surrounded by a diverse group of trainers. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Bethany, Sebastian said, gesturing towards her. She'll be working with us to develop our new cultural sensitivity workshops. The room fell silent. Bethany could feel the weight of their stares. She knew many of them were aware of her past actions, and she could sense their skepticism. Taking a deep breath, Bethany spoke. I know some of you might be wondering why I'm here, she said, her voice shaky but determined. I made mistakes in the past, but I'm here because I want to make things right. I want to help others learn from my errors. As the days passed, Bethany threw herself into her work. She spent hours poring over research, brainstorming ideas with the trainers, and sharing her own experiences. It wasn't easy. Sometimes she caught whispers or suspicious glances from her colleagues. One afternoon, during a team meeting, a trainer named Marcus spoke up. How can we trust that you've really changed? He asked Bethany directly. How do we know this isn't just for show? The room fell silent. Bethany felt her cheeks burn, but she met Marcus's gaze steadily. That's a fair question, she replied. I can't prove my sincerity with words alone, but I hope that my actions and my dedication to this program will show you that I'm committed to change. Sebastian watched the exchange with interest, nodding approvingly at Bethany's response. As weeks turned into months, Bethany's dedication began to pay off. The workshops she helped develop were receiving positive feedback from employees. Her personal story, which she shared openly in training sessions, resonated with many who struggled with their own biases. Slowly but surely, the skepticism around her began to fade. Who had once avoided her now sought her input. Even Marcus, who had been one of her harshest critics, began to warm up to her. One day, after a particularly successful workshop, Sebastian pulled Bethany aside. You're doing great work, he said, smiling warmly. I'm proud of how far you've come. Bethany felt a surge of emotion. Thank you, she said softly. This opportunity has changed my life. I just hope I'm making a difference. Sebastian nodded. You are. People are starting to see that change is possible. And that's a powerful message. As Bethany left the office that evening, she felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. She knew the journey wasn't over, there was still so much work to be done. But for the first time, she felt truly hopeful about the future. As weeks turned into months, the airline's cultural transformation began to gain significant momentum. Passengers and staff alike noticed a marked improvement in customer service and inclusivity across all aspects of their travel experience. One sunny afternoon, Sebastian sat in his office reviewing the latest feedback reports. A smile spread across his face as he read comment after comment, praising the airline's newfound commitment to diversity and respect. "Mr. Dixon," his assistant called, poking her head into the office. "You might want to see this." She handed him a tablet open to a major news site. The headline read, "Airlines Cultural Overhaul Sets New Industry Standard." Sebastian skimmed the article, his heart swelling with pride. It detailed the positive changes implemented by the airline, from improved staff training to more inclusive policies. The piece specifically highlighted how these reforms had led to a significant increase in customer satisfaction and employee morale. Meanwhile, Bethany was busy leading a training session for new flight attendants. As she shared her personal journey, she noticed the captivated expressions on the faces of her audience. "I used to think I was just doing my job," Bethany admitted, her voice filled with emotion. "But I realize now that my actions were hurting people. It wasn't easy to face my prejudices, but doing so has made me a better person and a better employee." After the session, a young trainee approached Bethany. "Your story is really inspiring," she said. "It makes me believe that real change is possible." Bethany felt a warmth in her chest. She was making a difference, just as she'd hoped. Later that week, Sebastian called a company-wide meeting to discuss the progress of their cultural transformation. As he stood before the gathered employees, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. "The changes we've made aren't just good for our passengers," Sebastian said, his voice carrying across the room. "They're good for all of us. We're creating a workplace where everyone feels valued and respected." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Bethany. "And I want to take a moment to recognize someone who has become a symbol of our transformation. Bethany, would you please stand?" Bethany rose, her cheeks flushing as all eyes turned to her. Bethany's journey, Sebastian continued, from acknowledging her mistakes to becoming a leader in our Cultural Sensitivity Initiative, shows us that change is possible when we're willing to confront our biases and learn from them. A round of applause filled the room. Bethany felt tears prick her eyes as she looked around at her colleagues, seeing respect and admiration where once there had been skepticism and distrust. As the meeting concluded, Sebastian approached Bethany. "You should be proud," he said warmly. "Your story is inspiring others to examine their own biases and work toward change." Bethany nodded, feeling a mix of humility and pride. "Thank you for giving me this chance," she replied. "I never imagined I could make such a difference." Bethany stood at the front of the training room, her heart racing with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. She looked out at the faces of the new group of employees, a diverse mix of men and women from various backgrounds. Taking a deep breath, she began her session on empathy and respect. "Good morning, everyone," Bethany said, her voice warm and inviting. "I'm here to share something important with you today, and it's not just about airline policies or customer service techniques. It's about understanding the impact our actions can have on others." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "I want to tell you a story, my story. It's not an easy one to share, but I believe it's crucial for you to hear." Bethany recounted the incident with Sebastian, her voice filled with emotion as she described her prejudiced behavior and the consequences that followed. The room was silent, all eyes fixed on her as she spoke. "I thought I was just doing my job," she explained, her voice cracking slightly. "But in reality, I was letting my biases control my actions. I didn't see the harm I was causing until it was too late." As she continued, Bethany noticed the expressions on the trainees' faces changing. Some looked shocked, others nodded in understanding, and a few even had tears in their eyes. The hardest part wasn't facing the consequences. Bethany admitted it was facing herself and acknowledging that she needed to change. But that moment of realization was also the beginning of her journey to become a better person and a better employee. She went on to describe the training she underwent and how it opened her eyes to the experiences of others. Bethany shared anecdotes from passengers who had faced discrimination, helping the trainees understand the real-world impact of such behavior. Every interaction we have with a passenger is an opportunity, Bethany said, her voice growing stronger. An opportunity to make someone feel valued, respected, and welcome. But it's also an opportunity to cause harm if we're not mindful of our biases. As the session progressed, Bethany encouraged the trainees to share their own experiences and thoughts. The room came alive with discussion, with many participants opening up about their own biases and fears. One trainee raised her hand. "I never realized how much impact small actions could have," she said. "Your story really makes me want to examine my own behavior." Bethany smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. This was why she did this work, to help others understand and grow just as she had. As the session drew to a close, Bethany felt a renewed sense of purpose. She saw in the faces of the trainees the same determination to change that she had felt at the beginning of her own journey. "Remember," Bethany said, as the trainees prepared to leave, "empathy and respect aren't just words. They're actions we choose to take every day, and those choices can make all the difference in someone's life." Sebastian stood at the back of the training room, watching Bethany with a mixture of pride and amazement. The woman leading the session with such passion and empathy was a far cry from the prejudiced flight attendant he'd encountered months ago. As Bethany guided the trainees through an exercise on recognizing unconscious bias, Sebastian couldn't help but reflect on their shared journey. He remembered the sting of that slap, the anger that had initially coursed through him. But instead of seeking revenge, he had chosen a different path, one of compassion and transformation. The airline had undergone a remarkable change. What was once a company plagued by discrimination, complaints were now hailed as a model for inclusivity in the industry. Sebastian's reforms had taken root, creating a culture of respect and understanding that permeated every level of the organization. Bethany's voice brought Sebastian back to the present. "Remember," she was saying, "every interaction is an opportunity to make someone feel valued and respected. Our words and actions have power. Let's use that power for good." The trainees nodded, their faces showing the same determination Sebastian had seen in Bethany when she first committed to change. It was a powerful reminder of how far they'd come. As the session wrapped up, Sebastian approached Bethany. "That was incredible," he said warmly. "You've really found your calling." Bethany's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd be here," she admitted. "Thank you for giving me the chance to make things right." Sebastian smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This, he realized, was the true meaning of ruthless revenge, not punishing those who wrong us, but helping them become better versions of themselves. In doing so, they had not only transformed Bethany and the airline, but had created a ripple effect of positive change. "We've both learned a lot," Sebastian said, placing a gentle hand on Bethany's shoulder. "And look at what we've accomplished together." As they looked out at the room full of eager trainees, ready to carry the message of inclusivity and respect to every corner of the airline, Sebastian felt a profound sense of hope. They had turned a moment of injustice into a catalyst for change, proving that compassion and the pursuit of justice could lead to the most satisfying form of redemption. If you enjoyed the story of Sebastian and Bethany, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. Hey friends, sorry to disturb you. Please take a moment to share your name and where you're watching this video from in the comments. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Your support means the world to us and plays a crucial role in promoting our channel. Because of you, we can share these important stories and shed light on injustices. You inspire us, and together we can make the world a better place. Enjoy the video. What if I told you that the next tale not only mirrors our previous journey, but also holds the key to unlocking a greater truth about humanity? Trust me, you won't want to miss it. In a world where titles should command respect, a Navy officer finds herself fighting for recognition, not just of her rank, but of her worth. Her journey unfolds in a single moment that challenges the very fabric of prejudice. Black Navy officer, denied first class until she reveals her rank to the pilot. Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams stood at the gate, her dark brown eyes heavy with exhaustion. The weight of her recent overseas assignment still clung to her shoulders, almost as tangible as the crisp navy uniform she wore. Her fingers absently traced the gold stripes on her sleeve, a reminder of the years of dedication that had brought her to this point in her career. The bustling airport swirled around her, a cacophony of announcements and hurried footsteps, but Naomi's mind was already on the comfort that awaited her. An unexpected ping on her phone had brightened her mood earlier, a notification of a first-class upgrade. It was a small luxury, but one she looked forward to after weeks of cramped quarters and grueling work. As she approached the boarding gate, Naomi allowed herself a small smile, anticipating the plush seat and extra legroom that would make the journey home more bearable. The line moved swiftly, and soon Naomi found herself stepping onto the plane. The narrow aisle of economy stretched before her, but she turned left towards the spacious first-class cabin. As she approached, a flight attendant with a pinched expression and blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun stepped into her path. "Excuse me," the attendant, whose name tag read Karen, said with a tone that felt more like an accusation than a question. "I think you may have made a wrong turn. Economy class is to the right." Naomi blinked, momentarily taken aback. She'd faced similar assumptions before, but it never failed to catch her off guard. "No, I'm in first class," she replied calmly, reaching for her boarding pass. Karen's eyes narrowed, flicking from Naomi's face to her uniform and back again. "There must be some mistake," she insisted, her voice taking on a condescending edge. "Let me see your ticket." Wordlessly, Naomi handed over her boarding pass. She watched as Karen scrutinized it, her lips pursed as if she tasted something sour. The other passengers in the first-class cabin began to take notice, their curious glances adding to the weight of the moment. "This must be a system error," Karen declared, handing the pass back with obvious reluctance. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move to economy. We can sort this out once we're in the air." Naomi felt a familiar heat rising in her chest, a mix of frustration and indignation that she had learned to control over years of similar encounters. She took a deep breath, centering herself before speaking. "There's no mistake," she said, her voice low but firm. "This is my assigned seat, and I intend to sit in it." Karen's face flushed, her customer service smile morphing into a thin line of displeasure. "I don't think you understand. If there's been an error—" "The only error," Naomi interrupted, her patience wearing thin, "is your assumption that I don't belong here. My ticket is valid, and I will be sitting in my assigned seat." The confrontation drew more attention now. Some passengers watched with open curiosity, while others pointedly looked away, uncomfortable with the growing tension. Naomi could hear whispers, fragments of conversations that made her skin prickle with anger and shame. Maybe she won a contest, probably using someone else's ticket. "I didn't know the military flew first class." Each comment, though not directed at her, chipped away at Naomi's composure. She stood straighter, her military bearing becoming more pronounced as she faced Karen's increasingly hostile stance. The flight attendant's hand hovered near the intercom, a silent threat to escalate the situation further. As the standoff continued, Naomi felt a familiar weariness settle over her. It was a fatigue born not just from her recent mission, but from a lifetime of having to justify her presence in spaces others deemed beyond her reach. She thought of her parents, who had instilled in her the strength to persevere in the face of prejudice. She remembered the challenges she'd overcome in the Navy, the barriers she'd broken, and the respect she'd earned through sheer determination and excellence. Yet here she stood, her accomplishments invisible beneath the color of her skin and the preconceptions of others. The irony of being questioned in her uniform, a symbol of her service to the very country that sometimes seemed to reject her, was not lost on Naomi. She felt her resolve harden, knowing this moment was about more than just a seat on a plane. It was about dignity, respect, and the ongoing struggle for equality that stretched far beyond this cabin. As Karen opened her mouth to speak again, Naomi steeled herself for what was to come. The flight was preparing for takeoff, but for Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams, a different kind of battle was just beginning. One fought not with weapons, but with unwavering conviction, and the quiet strength of those who have faced injustice time and time again. The air in the first-class cabin grew thick with tension as the confrontation continued. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending to be engrossed in their phones or magazines, while others watched with unabashed interest. The whispers that had started as a trickle now flowed more freely, a current of assumptions and prejudices that Naomi could feel pressing against her skin. "I've never seen someone like her in first class before," a middle-aged man in a crisp suit muttered to his seatmate. An elderly woman clutched her pearls, eyeing Naomi's uniform with suspicion. "In my day, people knew their place," she said, loud enough for several rows to hear. Each comment, each sidelong glance, each barely concealed sneer chipped away at Naomi's composure. She had faced discrimination before, but something about this moment, perhaps the exhaustion from her mission, perhaps the sheer audacity of being questioned in her uniform, made it harder to maintain her usual stoic facade. Memories flooded her mind, uninvited. She recalled her first day at the Naval Academy, standing tall among a sea of predominantly white faces, determined to prove herself. She remembered the extra hours she'd put in, the additional scrutiny she'd faced, always aware that as a black woman, she had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. There was the time she'd led a critical mission, her strategic decisions saving lives, only to have a junior officer question her authority in the debriefing. Or the countless social events where she was mistaken for waitstaff, despite her uniform and rank. Each incident had been a test, a chance to either break or grow stronger. Naomi had chosen the latter, time and time again. But now, standing in the aisle of this plane, she felt the weight of all those experiences pressing down on her. The cabin seemed to shrink, the judging eyes of passengers boring into her. She took a deep breath, centering herself, drawing on the inner strength that had carried her through far worse situations. Karen's voice cut through Naomi's thoughts, sharp and insistent. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you one last time to move to economy. We can't delay the flight any longer." Naomi met Karen's gaze, her voice low but firm. "And I'm telling you one last time that this is my assigned seat. I will not move." The standoff continued, neither woman willing to back down. Naomi could see the mix of frustration and disdain in Karen's eyes, a look she had encountered far too often in her life and career. It was the look of someone who couldn't fathom that a black woman could rightfully occupy a space of privilege. As the tension mounted, Naomi's thoughts drifted to her recent mission. She had led a team through a complex, high-stakes operation, making split-second decisions that affected national security. She had earned the respect and trust of her superiors and subordinates alike. The irony of commanding a naval vessel one day and being treated like an interloper the next was not lost on her. The other passengers were growing restless. A businessman checked his watch pointedly, sighing in exasperation. A young couple whispered to each other, casting furtive glances at Naomi. She could almost hear their thoughts. Why doesn't she just move? Why is she making such a fuss? Naomi felt a familiar anger rising within her, an anger born of a lifetime of similar experiences. But with it came a sense of resolve. She knew this moment was about more than just a seat on a plane. It was about challenging the assumptions that led people to question her presence in first class. It was about standing her ground not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong. She thought of her parents, who had taught her to hold her head high in the face of adversity. She remembered the words of her first commanding officer, a tough-as-nails woman who had told her, "In this world, you'll often be the only one who looks like you in the room. Make them remember you for your excellence, not your difference." In a world where rank should command respect, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams found herself fighting for the dignity she had earned, trapped in an uncomfortable standoff that mirrored the larger battle against prejudice. As the confrontation reached its peak, with Karen threatening to call security, Naomi stood her ground. Her military bearing became more pronounced, her spine straightening, her chin lifting. She was no longer just Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams. In that moment, she was a symbol of resilience and the ongoing fight against prejudice that persists long after laws have changed and barriers have officially fallen. The air in the cabin crackled with tension. Passengers held their breath, waiting to see how the standoff would end. Naomi could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment in their eyes, But she also sensed something else, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even shame, in some of their faces. It was as if her unwavering stance forced them to confront their own biases and question the assumptions that had led them to doubt her place among them. As Karen reached for the intercom, preparing to escalate the situation further, Naomi braced herself for what was to come. She knew that whatever happened next would be a testament to how far society had come regarding equality, and how far it still had to go. The next few moments would reveal whether justice and reason would prevail, or if the insidious tendrils of prejudice would once again assert their grip. The plane's engines hummed, ready for takeoff. But for Naomi and everyone in that first-class cabin, the journey ahead was about much more than physical distance. It was a journey into the heart of America's ongoing struggle with race, class, and the right to occupy spaces long denied to people like her. As she stood firm, Naomi silently vowed to see this through, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. The tension in the first-class cabin reached a fever pitch. Karen's hand hovered over the intercom, ready to call for backup, while Naomi stood resolute, her resolve unwavering. The other passengers watched with a mixture of discomfort and fascination, the air thick with unspoken judgments and barely concealed biases. Suddenly, a new presence entered the fray. Captain Jonathan Price emerged from the cockpit, his weathered face creased with concern. At 55, Price had seen his fair share of in-flight disturbances, but there was something about this situation that gave him pause. He took in the scene before him, Karen, flushed and defensive, Naomi composed but clearly under strain, and the passengers, a sea of conflicting emotions. "What seems to be the problem here?" Price asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Karen turned to him, relief evident in her voice. "Captain, this woman is insisting on sitting in first class. I've explained that there must be a mistake with her ticket, but she refuses to move to economy." Naomi met the captain's gaze steadily. "Sir, I have a valid first-class ticket. I'm being denied my seat based on assumptions." Price's eyes flickered to Naomi's uniform, noting the insignia and rank. He didn't immediately intervene, hoping to give both parties a chance to resolve the situation. "Let's take a look at that ticket, shall we?" he said, extending his hand. Naomi produced her boarding pass once again, handing it to the captain. Price examined it carefully, his expression neutral. The cabin held its breath, waiting for his verdict. After what felt like an eternity, Price looked up. "This ticket appears to be in order," he said, his tone measured. "Lieutenant Commander, is it?" A ripple of surprise went through the cabin. Karen's face paled as the significance of Naomi's rank sank in. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their earlier judgments settling heavily upon them. Naomi nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, sir. Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams, United States Navy." Price's demeanor shifted subtly, a newfound respect evident in his posture. He turned to Karen, his voice low but firm. "This officer is to be seated in her assigned seat immediately. We owe her an apology for this misunderstanding." Karen stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. We don't usually." "You don't usually what?" Naomi interjected, her calm facade finally cracking. "See black women in first class? See military personnel treated with respect? Which assumption are we dealing with here?" The captain raised a hand, trying to defuse the situation. In a world where respect often feels conditional, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams found herself not just reclaiming her seat on a plane, but also challenging the very fabric of societal bias that threatened to overshadow her identity. "Lieutenant Commander Williams, on behalf of the airline and this crew, I offer our sincerest apologies. This incident is unacceptable and will be addressed." Captain Price's voice carried authority as he turned to the other passengers. "Folks, I apologize for the delay. We'll be taking off shortly. I trust we can all treat each other with the respect we deserve." As Naomi finally took her seat, the mood in the cabin shifted palpably. Those who had doubted her now averted their eyes, shame coloring their features. Others looked at her with newfound admiration, perhaps seeing for the first time the strength it took to face such prejudice with dignity. Price lingered for a moment, clearly wrestling with his thoughts. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Lieutenant Commander, If you're willing, I'd like to speak with you after we land. My door is always open to fellow service members." Naomi nodded, a mix of emotions playing across her face. As Price returned to the cockpit and the flight prepared for takeoff, she found herself reflecting on the incident. The respect her rank commanded was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it had resolved the immediate conflict. On the other, it highlighted a painful truth. Her humanity alone hadn't been enough to warrant fair treatment. She thought about all the people who faced similar discrimination without the shield of a uniform or rank. The weight of representation settled heavily on her shoulders. Naomi knew that her actions in moments like these rippled far beyond her individual experience, potentially opening doors or closing them for others who would come after her. As the plane taxied down the runway, Naomi closed her eyes, allowing the adrenaline of the confrontation to ebb. She had stood her ground not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong. The battle was won, but the war against prejudice and assumptions was far from over. The incident had laid bare the insidious nature of bias, how it could lurk beneath the surface, ready to emerge even in spaces presumed to be equitable. It was a stark reminder that progress was not a straight line, but a constant struggle against deeply ingrained societal norms and expectations. As the plane lifted off, carrying its passengers into the sky, Naomi felt a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. The path ahead was clear. She would continue to navigate these spaces with grace and strength, challenging assumptions and paving the way for those who would follow. The sky may have been the limit for the aircraft, but for Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams, it was just the beginning of a much longer journey toward true equality and respect. Hey friends, sorry to disturb you. Please take a moment to share your name and where you're watching this video from in the comments. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Your support means the world to us and plays a crucial role in promoting our channel. Because of you, we can share these important stories and shed light on injustices. You inspire us, and together, we can make the world a better place. Enjoy the video. As the plane reached cruising altitude, an uncomfortable silence settled over the first-class cabin. The earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by a palpable awkwardness that seemed to permeate the air. Naomi sat in her rightful seat, her posture erect, her gaze fixed on the view outside the window. She could feel the furtive glances of the other passengers, their earlier disdain now transformed into a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment. Karen, the flight attendant who had been at the center of the confrontation, moved through the cabin with an air of forced cheerfulness. Her face was flushed, and her hands trembled slightly as she approached Naomi's seat. "Lieutenant Commander," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "can I get you anything? A drink, perhaps? Or a warm towel?" Naomi turned to face Karen, her expression neutral. "Water, please," she replied, her tone polite but devoid of warmth. As Karen hurried away, Naomi couldn't help but notice the change in her demeanor. The earlier hostility had been replaced by an almost obsequious attitude, a dramatic swing that felt uncomfortable, much like the initial confrontation. Naomi sighed inwardly, recognizing the familiar pattern, the overcorrection that often followed such incidents, where guilt and fear of repercussion led to exaggerated displays of courtesy. Around her, the other passengers seemed to grapple with their own discomfort. The businessman who had earlier checked his watch impatiently now stared resolutely at his laptop, fingers tapping a staccato rhythm on the keys. The elderly woman who had clutched her pearls in disdain now fumbled with her reading glasses, pointedly avoiding eye contact. The young couple who had whispered and stared now focused intently on the in-flight entertainment, their earlier curiosity replaced by studied indifference. Naomi felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her. There was a sense of vindication, yes, but it was tempered by a deep-seated wariness. In the wake of a confrontation that had laid bare the complexities of prejudice and privilege, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams found herself not just fighting for her place in first class, but also igniting a deeper reflection in those around her. How many times had she been in this position? How many times had her presence in spaces deemed not for her caused this ripple of discomfort and reassessment? The burden of constantly having to prove herself, of being the unwilling catalyst for others' self-reflection, weighed heavily on her shoulders. As Karen returned with the water, practically genuflecting as she placed it on Naomi's tray table, Naomi found herself reflecting on the broader implications of what had transpired. Her rank and uniform had forced respect from the flight crew and passengers, but what about those who didn't have such visible markers of authority? What about the countless individuals who faced similar prejudices without the shield of a military title? The thought brought a fresh wave of determination. Naomi realized that every such incident, every moment where she stood her ground, was not just about her personal dignity. It was about chipping away at the ingrained biases that led to such confrontations in the first place. It was about making spaces like this first-class cabin a little more accessible, a little more welcoming for those who would come after her. As the flight progressed, Naomi observed subtle shifts in the cabin's atmosphere. Some passengers, perhaps prompted by guilt or genuine curiosity, attempted to engage her in conversation. Their efforts were stilted, often beginning with awkward apologies or overly enthusiastic praise for her military service. Naomi responded with grace, but she couldn't shake the feeling that these interactions were more about assuaging their own consciences than genuine interest in her as a person. One passenger, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, leaned across the aisle. "I just wanted to say," she began hesitantly, "what happened earlier, it wasn't right. I'm sorry I didn't speak up." Naomi nodded, appreciating the woman's sincerity. "Thank you," she replied. "Speaking up can be difficult, but it's how we make change." As the conversation unfolded, Naomi found herself sharing snippets of her experiences, both in the military and as a Black woman navigating predominantly white spaces. She spoke of the challenges, yes, but also of the moments of connection that transcended race and rank. The woman listened intently, her expression a mixture of shock and growing understanding. By the time the captain announced their descent, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted once again. The awkward silence had given way to a more reflective quiet. Naomi could sense that her presence, her dignity in the face of adversity, had sparked something in her fellow passengers. Perhaps it was the beginning of self-examination, a questioning of long-held assumptions. As the plane touched down, Naomi felt a familiar mix of exhaustion and resolve. The incident on this flight was just one battle in a long war against prejudice and discrimination. But as she gathered her belongings, catching the respectful nods of her fellow passengers, she allowed herself a small smile. Each confrontation faced, each bias challenged, was a step toward a world where her presence in first class, or any space, would be unremarkable. Stepping off the plane, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams squared her shoulders, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She carried with her not just the weight of her own experiences, but the hope for a future where such incidents would be relics of the past. As the passengers began to disembark, Naomi remained in her seat, her mind still processing the events of the flight. She was surprised to see Captain Jonathan Price emerge from the cockpit, making his way down the aisle toward her. His face bore a mixture of concern and determination as he approached. "Lieutenant Commander Williams," he began, his voice low and respectful. "If you have a moment, I'd like to speak with you privately." Naomi nodded, curiosity overriding her fatigue. She followed Captain Price to a quiet corner of the now empty first-class cabin, away from the bustling activity of departing passengers. Price took a deep breath before speaking. "First, I want to extend my deepest apologies for what transpired earlier. It was unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed at the highest levels of our organization." Naomi appreciated the sentiment but had heard similar promises before. She remained silent, waiting to see where this conversation would lead. Price continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "What happened today? It's made me reflect on some uncomfortable truths. I've always prided myself on running a professional crew, on treating everyone equally. But watching that situation unfold, I realized that sometimes staying neutral isn't enough." As the dust settled from the confrontation, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams found herself at the crossroads of reflection and action, where her experiences had the potential to inspire change beyond her own journey. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I'm reminded of an incident involving my niece," She's biracial, and last year at her college graduation, she was stopped and questioned multiple times while trying to enter the ceremony venue. I wasn't there, but when she told me about it later, I didn't fully grasp the impact it had on her. I told her it was probably just a misunderstanding. Naomi felt a familiar pang of recognition. How many times had her own experiences been dismissed as misunderstandings? Price's eyes met hers, filled with a newfound understanding. Seeing what happened to you today hit me hard. That's probably how my niece felt. Questioned, doubted, made to feel like she didn't belong in a space she had every right to occupy. And I realized that my neutrality, my attempt to not take sides, was actually part of the problem. Naomi nodded slowly. It often is, she said softly. Neutrality in the face of injustice usually serves to maintain the status quo. Price nodded, a look of determination crossing his face. You're absolutely right, and that's why I wanted to speak with you. I know an apology isn't enough, but I want you to know that this incident has opened my eyes. I'm committed to doing better, to actively working against these kinds of biases in my crew and in myself. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. I have a somewhat unusual request, if you're willing. I'd like to invite you to visit the cockpit before you leave. It's a small gesture, I know, but I want to make it clear to every member of this crew that you are not just welcome in first class, but in every part of this aircraft. Naomi was taken aback by the offer. It was a symbolic gesture, yes, but one that carried weight. She considered for a moment before responding. Thank you, Captain Price. I appreciate your honesty and your offer. I think I'd like that. As they made their way to the cockpit, Naomi felt the eyes of the remaining crew members on her. The mix of curiosity, respect, and lingering discomfort was palpable. Price introduced her to the co-pilot and flight engineer, making a point to emphasize her rank and accomplishments. Inside the cockpit, surrounded by the complex array of instruments and controls, Naomi felt a sense of kinship with the aviation world. She shared some of her experiences flying naval aircraft, finding common ground with the pilots in their love of flight and respect for the complexities of aviation. As their conversation drew to a close, Price turned to Naomi with a serious expression. Lieutenant Commander, I want you to know that your presence today, your dignity in the face of discrimination, has made a real impact, not just on me, but on everyone who witnessed it. You've sparked conversations and reflections that needed to happen. Naomi nodded, feeling the weight of his words. That's often the burden we carry, she replied. Every confrontation, every moment of standing our ground becomes a teachable moment for others. It's exhausting, but it's how change happens. Price extended his hand. Thank you for your service, both in the military and in moments like these. You've reminded us all that there's still work to be done, and that neutrality isn't an option when it comes to fighting discrimination. As Naomi shook his hand and prepared to leave, she felt a mix of emotions. Exhaustion from the confrontation, appreciation for Price's willingness to learn and change, and a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that this incident, like many before it, would fuel her ongoing commitment to breaking barriers and challenging assumptions. Stepping out of the cockpit, Naomi straightened her uniform and held her head high. The journey home had been unexpectedly turbulent, but she emerged from it stronger, having once again proven that she belonged in every space she chose to occupy. As she walked through the terminal, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams carried with her not just her personal victory, but the hope for a future where such victories would no longer be necessary. As Naomi stepped out of the cockpit and into the jet bridge, she felt a subtle shift in the air around her. The crew members who had earlier regarded her with suspicion or embarrassment now watched her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. She could sense the weight of their gazes, heavy with unspoken apologies and newfound understanding. Walking through the terminal, Naomi's mind raced with the events of the past few hours. The confrontation in first class, the intervention of Captain Price, the awkward silence that followed, and finally, the unexpected invitation to the cockpit. Each moment replayed in her mind, a kaleidoscope of emotions and experiences that she knew would stay with her for a long time. As she navigated the bustling airport, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams felt the weight of her experiences reflected in the glances of those around her, a reminder of the societal complexities she faced. As she made her way through the crowded terminal, Naomi noticed how people reacted to her presence. Some did double takes, their eyes lingering on her uniform and the gold stripes on her sleeve. Others nodded respectfully, a few even offering quiet, "Thank you for your service," as she passed. It was a stark contrast to the treatment she had received on the plane, and yet Naomi knew that both reactions, the earlier discrimination and the current respect, were two sides of the same coin. Both were based on external factors rather than her inherent worth as a human being. Finding a quiet corner near her next gate, Naomi sat down, allowing herself a moment to process everything. She pulled out her phone, contemplating whether to share the incident with her family or colleagues. Her thumb hovered over the screen as she weighed the pros and cons of speaking out. On one hand, sharing her experience could raise awareness and potentially prevent similar incidents in the future. On the other, she felt the familiar wariness of always having to be the one to educate, to challenge, to push for change. As she sat there, Naomi overheard snippets of conversation from nearby passengers. Word of the incident had spread quickly. She caught a mix of opinions, from outrage at the discrimination she had faced to uncomfortable justifications for the flight attendant's behavior. One conversation in particular caught her attention. "I can't believe that happened," a young woman was saying to her companion. "It makes me wonder how many times I've seen something like that and not spoken up." Her friend nodded solemnly. "It's easy to think these things don't happen anymore, but clearly they do. We all need to do better." Hearing these words, Naomi felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, the incident had been painful and exhausting, but it had also sparked conversations, made people question their assumptions, and opened eyes to the reality of ongoing discrimination. Her stand hadn't just been for herself, it was for countless others who faced similar situations every day. With this realization, Naomi made a decision. She opened her notes and began to write, documenting the incident in detail. She would report it officially, not just to the airline, but to her superiors in the Navy as well. Not as a complaint, but as a call to action, a way to advocate for better training, increased awareness, and systemic change. As she typed, Naomi reflected on her journey, not just the flight but her entire career. Every challenge she had faced, every barrier she had broken, had prepared her for moments like these. She thought of the young sailors under her command, especially the women and people of color who looked to her as a role model. Her actions today, her refusal to be displaced or disrespected, weren't just for her. They were for all those who would come after her, who deserved to walk into any space without their belonging being questioned. Finishing her notes, Naomi stood up, straightening her uniform with practiced precision. She felt a familiar fire in her belly, a combination of determination and hope that had fueled her throughout her career. Yes, there was still work to be done. Yes, the journey toward true equality was ongoing. But every step forward, every confrontation faced with dignity, and every mind open to new perspectives. These were victories worth celebrating. As she headed toward her connecting flight, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams walked with her head held high. She carried with her not just the weight of her experiences, but the strength of her convictions and the power of her example. In her stride was the quiet resolve of a woman who knew her worth, who had earned her place, and who would continue to pave the way for others. The airport bustled around her, a microcosm of society with all its flaws and potential. Through it all, Naomi moved forward, her presence a testament to resilience, her journey a beacon of hope. She was more than her rank, more than her uniform, and more than the color of her skin. She was a force for change, one step, one flight, one conversation at a time. As she boarded her next flight, Naomi allowed herself a small smile. The battle for equality and respect was far from over, but she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, the sky had never been the limit for Lieutenant Commander Naomi Williams. It was just the beginning.